Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Okay. So we are, the meal that Abraham presented the strangers, right? So Jocelyn, you're going to love what we're about to do. I know it was off the record yesterday or the other day when you asked me this question of how are angels eating, and I told you about this, and here we actually have the passage. It's from Baba Metzia, page 86b. Right? Vayochlu, and they ate. In other words, it mentions, right, that they actually ate it. They ate the food he gave them. Here we go, Melahila Sot, etc. So Ben Bakar, very good. That's that he took it. Let me see. But Tobi Tin La Navi Mela So Oto. So the point is though that they ate. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda. So Ben Bakar is what we're looking at. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Oh no, sorry. Okay. Vayochlu. Right. Here it is, Vayochlu in this verse here. Forgive me. Amar Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chanilai, said Rabbi Tanchum Bar Chanilai, Le'olam al yishane adam min haminhag, that a person shouldn't change the customs in a particular place. For example, if I go to a synagogue and they have certain customs, that's the way I should try and perform myself. I shouldn't try and change those customs. Shehare Moshe ala lamarom, because we see that Moses went up to the heavens, v'lo achal lechem, and he didn't eat any bread. In other words, while he was up on Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, and he was up there actually for a total ultimately of 120 days. They weren't so consecutive, but he did wind up being there 120 days, but he didn't eat anything because up in heaven they don't eat food. Malachei Hasharet and the ministering angels, right? Yardu lamata, they came down to the bottom. V'achlu lechem, and they ate bread. Dichtiv vayochlu, because it says vayochlu. It says specifically they ate. They ate. So this is going to create a whole bunch of issues, as you could imagine. All right, here we go. Here we go. Hang on to your yarmulkes. Masha amra va'achlu lechem, right? The fact that it says lechem, which is the actual passage here, it doesn't say it, right? But in Baba Metzia it does say vayochlu lechem. He's changed, and he does. He mentions that one of the things he does that the Torah Temimah does is that he takes the original Gemara and he tries to put the Hebrew or the Aramaic into a little bit easier way to understand. So. But love dafkahu, that even though in Baba Matzia it says they ate lechem, they ate bread, we can't say that that is exactly what it meant. It doesn't mean it exactly. Shaharei muvu'ar la'el, because we already clarified above, bidrasha barosh pasuk zeh, at the drasha, and the interpretation at the very beginning of this verse, shelo hevi lechem lesudazo. We said Abraham didn't bring bread. We made a point. It doesn't mention bread. He says to the angels initially that he's going to give them a loaf of bread to eat. And then, of course, when he starts to bring the meal itself, it doesn't mention that he brought bread. And we discussed that already, right? So, Yehuyanshan, check it out. Ela klap kalefish amar b'Moshe, right? But because where it mentions in the verse which talks about Moses up on Mount Sinai and in heaven, and there the verse says v'lo achal lechem. It says he did not eat bread, or it's possible that he means that here it says in the Gemara verse it says he did not eat bread. But I believe there's a verse that says he did not eat bread. Nakat nami b'malachim lechem. So for that reason, just to parallel the phrase, you might say, as for a stylistic reason, it says regarding the angels, they didn't eat bread, right? Uktzat tzarich iyun. But we still need to look a little bit more carefully. Shinakat inyanim shelo al haseder. Because if you look at the way in which the Gemara mentions it mentions it out of order. In what sense? Sharei Maaseh Yeridat HaMalachim, because if we look at the order of the Torah, the angels coming down, Hayta Kodem, it came first. Aliyat Moshe Marom. It preceded Moses going up to the heavens, and yet when it mentions this here, it mentions Moses first, right? So he's mentioning that is something to take note of. The imkain, and if this is the case, right? If the angels coming down first was in fact the order, and Moses going up Seder, it should have started the proof of this principle that a person shouldn't change whatever the minhag is in a particular locale, right? And to end with Moses. I mean, it should have been a little bit more careful. So why not? So we're going to address that. And you could say, Tinakat b'derech lo zo af zo. That's simply what he's saying, not only this, but that. In other words, that the way in which this proof is going is it's saying to prove it is not only did Moses not eat bread up in heaven, but even the angels did eat down on earth, right? So, and the reason here, Lomar, the Yaduahu, and what he meant to say, right? He wants to really say, the Yaduahu, that we all know, the Kvod Shamayim, that having respect for what goes on in heaven, Meruba Michvod Haaretz, it goes way more than whatever the honor is due down here. That the honor one would owe up in heaven is way greater than the honor due down on earth. In other words, to put it, I'll try and tease it out a little bit more. In other words, it might have been good enough for Moses not to eat bread up in heaven, and for the angels not to eat bread down here. And what the Gemara is doing in reversing the order is saying that not only did Moses not eat bread in heaven, but even the angels down on earth ate bread down there. In other words, they didn't change the customs of the place. And this is the reason, not only that one has to hold on to whatever the practices are in heaven, like Moses, but even the angels, when it came to the way in which things are done on the earth, one should not change. So that's one thing. We have not finished. Bichlal tzarich iyun. But in general, we still need to look at this more carefully. Ma ra'aya mehamalachim. What is the proof from the angels? Why do we say? After all, didn't we just say that the angels ate? Taha mikevan shehakadosh baruch hu shalchan b'mechuvan la'Avraham, because we could argue that since God sent them intentionally to Abraham, kedei shelo yitzta'er, in other words, so that he wouldn't get upset, right? Because remember, you may recollect that we said that the angels showed up. If we look at the order in the Tanakh and in the Torah, and we try to infer things from the location of where they are, the visiting of the angels comes right after the circumcision of Abraham. And of course, he was at that point recovering from his circumcision. And at the time, despite the fact that he was in recovery, he loved showing hospitality so much. And maybe Sarah to a lesser extent, but nevertheless, she certainly supported her husband. And Abraham was looking to see if anyone was around, if there were any wayfarers that he could offer the hospitality to. And when no one was showing up, he was getting upset about the fact that he didn't have the opportunity to show hospitality. And so God intentionally sent these three angels so that he wouldn't be upset. He wouldn't be mitzvah, right? So we know that this is a very intentional thing that God sent these angels, right? And precisely right? So that he could show hospitality. Me'ader orchim. In other words, Abraham was upset because I was getting upset from the lack of visitors, from guests. Arba Agada, as was clarified in this legend, Dekan Uva Midrashim, that we mentioned in regards to this particular passage, Uva Midrashim, and in the Midrashim. Imkain. And if we say that, Halo hayu muchrachim lechol, we're saying the whole purpose of their coming was so that he could provide hospitality. So if they weren't going to eat, right, he would have been upset. I mean, that's the whole point. They came so that they could enjoy his hospitality. In other words, because if he wasn't able to feed them, he would have been upset. vaYeshlomar. And how do we answer this then? Dekevan shaya yachol HaKadosh Baruch Hu lazmin elav anashim mamash. We could still say that it was possible for God not to have to send angels. God could have sent regular human beings to him, uvechol zech shalach malachim, but nevertheless decided to send angels. Shma mina, we learn she'en k'vneva, that there's no strictness. Im yu noagim kan kaminhag bnei adam. If angels were acting like human beings, that there was no strict need for angels not to eat here. Mishum she'ein deshanon min hamehag, and we could say because it is from the principle, right up you might call it a halachic principle, that one doesn't change the customs of a place, the way in which people do things. So, for example, if they eat before davening in this particular place, you eat before davening, even if it's your practice to eat after davening, and vice versa. V'hine, going on, v'hine, and indeed, afalpi to bedrasha haba'ah, that in the next interpretation that we have, mevu'ar, it is going to be clear, shelo hayu ochlim mamash. We're going to say that they didn't actually eat, right? We're really concerned about this business of angels eating. So Jocelyn, I would say that you were on the money in your concern about that in the last time we met. So there is a drasha that says they didn't actually physically eat, ela nir'im keochlim, but it looked as if they were eating. They just appeared to eat. But nevertheless, I think it's tikkun, we still can establish gam hara'aya, still the proof, she'ein l'shanot min hamag. We could still say, even if they didn't actually physically eat, we could still say we have a proof that one should not, in fact, change the custom of a place. Right? Mishum, because the mizeh gufa, right? Because from this, we still are saying, right? Shehishtadlu laharot keochlin, that it was important enough to appear as if they were eating. So even if they didn't actually eat, but they appeared as if they were eating, that was for the sake of not changing what takes place in this world itself, that angels themselves had to act in that particular way. Okay. Alkain, and for this reason, asuchein, they, in fact, even though they didn't physically eat, they appeared as if they were eating, mishum haminhag k'movar, on account of this particular principle, or according to the custom of the place, as has been explained. V'yein od, okay, and check further, masha katuv b'drasha haba'ah, what is going to be mentioned in our next interpretation. I'll pause for a second in case you have any questions. I will mention, though, it is interesting that the issue of the milk and the meat is still out there. It does not respond to the milk and meat issue. I believe we tried to respond to that earlier on in a previous lesson, but in case you missed it, I was saying that there are two possibilities. Okay. The first possibility is that in fact that particular halacha was given at Mount Sinai, that halacha was where we don't mix milk with meat, took place later. Another possible interpretation And the reason why there's more than one interpretation, as I had read in Steinsaltz, is because if there's no really satisfactory explanation, you need more than one explanation. And the other is that the way it's stated in the Torah is you shall not seethe the kid in its mother's milk, right? And that the interpretation that goes beyond that, in terms of all the strictures we have with regard to the not mixing milk with meat, I believe is rabbinic. In other words, they're so concerned that you should appear to be doing it, or that when you serve it together, it might look as if you did, etc., etc. Although I will say at this particular point, having studied it only to the point that I have, I would have to say that I believe it's rabbinic. Even though it's only stated that way, it's possible that if we were to apply some of the rules of interpretation and logic applied to the legal statements in the Torah, in that case, it would be Torah law itself and not a rabbinic stricture. So let's go to the next statement. So here we go. Vayochlu, and they ate. Achlu salkadatach. Are you going to say they actually ate? Ela ema, but let me say, I will say, nir'ah kamoshachlu v'shatu. It looked as if they ate and drank, but they didn't actually physically eat. This is also in Bama Metzia, page 86b. Uva Midrash Rabbah, and in the Midrash Rabbah, a siyem bazeh, right? They end this particular idea, Rishon mistalek. In other words, what they did is, as they ate, the food disappeared. So it looked as if they were eating. In other words, it's trying to narrow down exactly what was going on. Okay, how did it appear? So that as they took the food itself, I believe is what they're saying here, disappeared. Upashut kavanat hadvarim, right? And clearly, pashut, straightforward, kavanat hadvarim, the intention of these words, dekasher lo, that it was hard for the author of this midrash, lahamidrash, ech shayach nirim kilchlim, right? So lahamidaresh, that the one who was the author of this midrash, exactly how can we say that it appeared as if they ate velo ochlim mamash, but they weren't actually eating? In other words, he's to say that they appeared to be eating but weren't eating. How did that exactly take place? And the author of the midrash is trying to explain this. V'halo haya Avraham margish pazeh. In other words, if in fact it looked as if they were eating, but they were just putting the food aside, something like that, Abraham certainly would have noticed that, right? He would have noticed that they weren't really eating. Uvadai hamitzte'er, and for sure he would be upset about that if he saw that they merely were sort of pretending to eat, but they weren't under normal circumstances. So we have to say something, right, that the food itself was disappearing. Vehem halo tachlit poam, and indeed, the whole purpose of their arriving, we were elav to him. We already said, haya shelo yitztaer, that he shouldn't be upset. Hamimeniat kiyum mitzvah hachnasat orchim k'mavorar, that he shouldn't be upset from the fact that he was prevented from actually performing the commandment of hachnasat orchim, or hospitality, k'mavorar, as we've explained already. Lachen pishu rishon mistalek. And for this reason, the author of this midrash says that little by little, right, each little piece disappeared as they were putting it towards their mouth. Klomar, that is to say, she'al pi nes, that it was a miracle, haya mistalek ma'at ma'at, that the food would disappear a little at a time, mehashulchan, from the table. Im nisraf or shekala binyan acher, if it was burned or it ended in some other way, it disappeared in some other way. So saying it was burnt is just trying to say physically how this miracle was taking place. In other words, again, he's going a step further to try and describe exactly how it disappeared. Okay. V'katvu hatosafot. And the Tosafot, we've mentioned them before, right? Rashi's grandchildren who appear on the page of the Gemara as well. V'zeh l'shonam. And this, to quote the Tosafot. Uveseder Eliyahu Rabbah, and this is another midrash called Seder Eliyahu Rabbah. Ketani, it teaches, Lo ke'oto she'omer nir'an ke'ochlin, that in the Eliyahu Rabbah, it doesn't hold like those who say that they weren't actually eating vishotin and drinking. Ela ochlin vishotin mamash, but in the Eliyahu Rabbah, which is an authoritative piece, they disagree, quite openly disagree with what is said in Baba Metzia, right? And it said they were actually eating. Why? Mipnei kvodo shel Avraham, right? On account of the honor that was due Abraham, that the angels were actually eating and drinking. Ufliga adahacha. So they disagree, right? There's a disagreement with what we just said up to now. Adkan l'shonam. That's the end of the quote from Tosafot there. Typical action of the Tosafot to raise questions. Yes, question?
Yeah.
David. Yes,
So
David.
I guess the question here is, what is the significance or why is it important to analyze this particular portion of it? I guess I mean, what I was going to say was, I mean, they're angels, right? I mean, so they have the power of God. I mean, they could make you see whatever you wanted to see, I'm sure, or, you could take it along all those lines. There's not really a reason to have to go into the actual physical or the concept of what happened, because we already know that because they're angels, basically they could make Abraham see probably whatever they wanted him to see, right? If they wanted him to see that the food was disappearing or that they were eating it, that would be the case. So what is the point of, or why are we delving so deeply into this, and why are you laughing?
I'm
So
laughing because that's exactly where we're going to go with this continuation of the Torah Temimah. I love it. It shows, David, it should make you feel really good that you are thinking along the same lines.
okay, all right,
But,
I'll
but
wait.
I'm not saying we're going to go exactly, to the position you held, but let's see what they say. But you'll see. The very next statement is vehine, and indeed, be'emet ein hechrech ze mukhrach. He says, why do they say this? They didn't have to say it, and that's the point that you're making. What was so important about having to feel that they needed to say that the angels were actually eating, that the Seder Eliyahu Rabbah felt a need to actually mention this, or Tosafot for that matter, to bring it up? Lefi Shema Katuv, right? That according to what had written already, the afilu im nefaresh near im kochlem, because the whole point is that he's going to go in a little bit of a different direction, but the point you're making is the same point, because even if we explain near im kochlem that it only appeared as if they were eating, lo haya Avraham margish, then we've just explained how Abraham wouldn't have realized it, right? That according to the comment we just made, Abraham would not have realized. And so remember, the Eliyahu Rabbah was saying that they actually physically ate because they needed to honor Abraham and not make him feel bad. But the point is that we already said that even if they only appeared to be eaten the way we just explained, he wouldn't have felt bad. He wouldn't have realized it. Okay, so why? Lefi Masha Katuv b'Midrash Rabbah, just as we explained in the Midrash Rabbah, Rishon. In other words, bit by bit, right? Mistalek, the food disappeared. As we just said above. The Yoter said, and not only this, we could go further and say, I think it could be al korchacha. You have to say, ein hechreach lomar. There's no proof, right? One doesn't have to say. There's no need to say demishum kvodo shel Avraham hu ochlim mamash. In other words, saying that the reason they had to eat actually was on account of the honor due to Abraham, that in itself is not really convincing or compelling in any way. Sha'arei kamochen kativ malachim, right? Because indeed it's written written concerning the angels, Shiba'u Elot. In other words, we're going to go a step further. The angels didn't just visit Abraham. Two of the angels wound up visiting Lot as well, okay? Umitzvat matzot afar vayochelu, and it mentions that Lot baked matzahs and they ate. It says also there they ate. And are we comparing? He's going to write into it. He's going to smash into the fact that uvevadai, and we certainly would say lo shayach gam sham lomar mipnei kvodo shalot. In other words, if we're going to argue that the angels actually ate on account of the honor due to Abraham, it wouldn't work for Lot. Lot didn't deserve that kind of honor. Abraham, yeah, for sure. But it says they ate. And if we're saying that they ate actually, and we're going to then have to say they ate actually for Lot, well, does the argument that the reason they ate actually was out of honor for Lot? Ve'al korchacha. And for this reason, tzarich lefaresh. We actually are forced to say sham nir'im ke'ochlim, right? We'd have to explain with regard to Lot for sure that it appeared as if they were eating. And so likewise in the case of Abraham as well. David, are you happy with this explanation?
Well, yeah, I'm happy with it in the sense that, it kind of, it's to the same point. It doesn't really, yeah, it doesn't explain again why there's so much detail being paid to it, but it does, but I'm happy with the explanation. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So if you're not happy with the detail, what can I say? You
No,
know,
no, what I meant was, they still haven't, they point out the fact that there's contradictions in terms of, trying to explain it, which makes sense. It's just they didn't really talk about the fact as to what, why it was important to explain it, or what was the necessity associated with it. So that was, unless it was just all about trying to give honor to Abraham, and in that case, then they've kind of blown that whole thing apart. So
right,
that's probably fair.
right,
So
right. So here's one. I mean, I may be misunderstanding where you're coming from, but clearly this is rigorous, right? In
yeah,
other words, we are being rigorous
yeah,
in terms of any possible problems that we have. The truth is, though, having read this, Torah Temimah clearly disagrees with Tosafot's point that they make,
yeah,
and feels that Seder Eliyahu Rabbah is not correct. That the statement on the part of there is it can be contradicted. There's a compelling contradiction against the argument of Eliyahu Rabbah, and in that sense, he wonders perhaps why Tosafot even mentioned this.
yeah,
So, yeah,
exactly right. So, but then they're right. But then are we going to take it the step further of, okay, you found the contradiction, asking the question, then what was the point in the first place, right? But that's kind of where,
okay.
yeah,
All right. So the basic lesson that got us into this whole rigmarole had to do with the idea of not changing people's customs,
yeah, yeah,
not walking in. And if that is in fact a point of halakha, and not only that, but it is an important character suggestion in terms of respect and how you respect people and their customs, even if they're different from yours. I think that's actually a very important point.
yep. Okay,
And
got
that's
it.
why it's worth going into all this kind of detail to support that ultimately, and to have to deal with the possible difficulties and contradictions that it raises, given the fact that these are angels.
Yep. No, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Okay, so let me stop the share. I'm going to mark the place here. Give me one moment to do that. And next time we meet, we'll pick it up here and look at the verse that we're dealing with when we get there. And Jocelyn, you have a question, and I'm going to stop the share. Go ahead, Jocelyn.
Isn't it true that angels generally have only one task at a time?
Wow. That's amazing. Yes, it is. So I have to say that if it's one task, doesn't mean they have one task. When it gets done, that's the end of it. So I have two thoughts regarding this. One is that appears to very minor angels. In other words, there are ministering angels that have a level of permanence. And I think, that really begs another question, which is, why is that so important? I think it's so important because we don't want to give angels the kind of power and authority that we want to give to God. That angels are simply an extension in a way of trying to explain the connection between God, who is completely transcendent, and the fact that God is at work in this world. And angels are a way of speaking about it. So we could say that that only applies to, angels that are actually set up, as it were, to perform a task, and that would not apply to ministering angels. Now, that's one way to go. I have another way to go. So it's interesting that the reason why there were three angels that appeared to Abraham, right, was the one Raphael came to help Abraham heal from his circumcision, right? I believe there was Gabriel who was there to destroy the city of Sodom. And I'm going to guess that maybe we're talking about Michael, that the third angel was Michael who came to save Lot. And what is really interesting is that only two angels show up at Lot's house. And that is because they didn't need Raphael anymore. In other words, when we say angels have only one task, in a sense, what we're saying is they have one responsibility. And that responsibility, in other words, the need to heal, is a major, major responsibility. And so that we have Raphael around all the time in order to bring healing to people. That is his task. He doesn't do anything else. And Gabriel is there to to evidence God's power and justice, right? And Michael is there to save people, not necessarily from illness, but from danger. And each one
Okay,
has a
so
specific task, and that's what we mean.
you referenced that these angels came down so that Abraham would not feel disappointed
Right,
that no one came
correct.
to. Okay, but they actually came down. I mean, it seems like their priority would have been what you just explained rather than to have Abraham feel better that no one was coming so they would be there and they had come.
Right, but if we're talking from Abraham, we may know that there were other reasons for them being there, but
Ah.
in relationship to Abraham, right? Because after all, I'm trying to think, possibly whether, trying to think if whether Gabriel or Michael would have been the one to tell Abraham that Sarah was going to bear a child, right? Because that was
Yes, that
also
makes
part of
sense.
their mission. And that, in fact, could apply to the two other angels besides Raphael.
But the point that I was making is that it seems like they had more than one mission in mind for this visit.
The mission, okay, they were sent by God in other words, it was incidental in a way that they were coming necessarily to make Abraham feel better, right?
Right.
But that would come automatically from the other reasons that they came. In other words, the prime good point you're making, you're being rigorous, okay? But again, we could go then back to the ministering angels, and that ministering angels, basically don't have the strictures that other angels have. But at the same time, I could say that from Abraham's point of view, right, the reason they were there was to make him feel better. And even if they had other things to do, their actual missions were exactly what I pointed out. In other words, to help Abraham heal, to bring the news about Sarah, and then to go on to Lot to destroy the city of Sodom and also to rescue Lot. And that's why only two angels, and it mentions just two angels showing up at Lot. And of course, it would also give the reason why there might be three is that it gave Abraham pleasure to host three people and not just one.
Hmm.
So I feel there's a difference between coming to make Abraham feel better, which feels much more ancillary. In other words, that has to do with where they showed up. They still had their missions. But
Exactly. So
but
that's why I
where
was
but
thinking
where they but where they went to do it was coincidental.
coincidental.
In a sense. I just meant in the ancillary sense that it was a secondary thing. It didn't have the prime point of of healing and destroying and rescuing. The point is this: did it require an angel to do? Which one required an angel? Showing up at Abraham's place, was that require? Did it require an angel? On the other hand, healing Sarah, did that require an angel? Yes, it did. You see the difference?
Yes.
Well, that's the special quality of the angel. So they still had one mission, each one.
Hmm.
In other words, we could say each angel has a unique mission.
Oh, I see.
But the fact
Okay.
that could have been accomplished by people showing up, it didn't
Uh-huh.
require an angel, but it did require an angel to do the other things.
I see. Okay.
Okay, maybe it's too subtle a distinction, but I'm holding on to that particular possibility as best as I
Okay.
can argue it. Okay.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Mead, you've been awfully silent.
Absorbing.
Okay.
Going to
All right.
try
Well,
to, well, the subject of angelology and demonology
mhm.
is one that the rabbis clearly were obsessed with.
Well,
And,
well,
and
it's just about anything.
well, there's obsession about what's the right way to do a sacrifice or the right way to do, uh, observe a particular commandment. But the ancillary midrashic component of these supernatural beings is one that is both fascinating and, to my mind, a little bit out in the weeds, where these people,
Right.
these rabbis were just driven by their need to explain XYZ, and their fears, their hopes, their dreams are projected into these stories. That's all.
I think in some senses I would agree with you, but I would also tell you love is in the details. So you
Well,
realize that when you
yes,
love something, other people and that other people don't love it so much, they're not going to understand your behavior.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and they took very seriously, and this is at least something that I think about a lot, is how consistent, what kind of human beings do we want to be? Do we want our word really to be our bond? Do we really want to fulfill the statements that we make about our beliefs and our practices and our ideals? Or are we kind of loose about that? So when you say, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, do you want to say that rigorously? Do you want to be rigorous about it? Or do you want to sort of be, well, it's a nice idea.
It's an overriding principle.
It is an
Uh,
overriding principle, and
and the
it's a
question is
lifelong task. Yeah, it's
to
a
what
lifelong.
degree will you push yourself into those words and say, okay, I have a given act in front of me. I
Yes,
have to consider it in light of that particular
correct,
commandments.
correct.
And as opposed to, yeah, it's just intuitive to do the right thing, if
Yeah.
you will.
Right. And it's not intuitive, in my humble opinion. Okay. It's a big, how can I say it? Uh, hmm. There's an expression in English for that, which I'm escaping me right now, but hobby horse of mine to say, that we we tend to like to do that kind of thing, that we don't really think that carefully about what we're saying and what we mean,
Well,
that
that's
it's so
absolutely
human to just say, oh yeah, these are nice ideas, but to actually try to practice it, no, and Judaism is saying no, it's something we need to give serious consideration to. And
well, it becomes a job, we'll put it that way,
or
to have
or
to consider each individual possible action as opposed to you look at something and on the face of it, yep, this is the right thing to do, it's not the right thing to do, as opposed to I have to look at this commandment and say, where does it fit in light of that commandment?
So also, don't forget, you either really enjoy doing this stuff or you don't. Okay? And I think there's an aesthetic quality to it as well. That
Yeah,
I think that real mathematicians love the detail that you get into when you get into pure mathematics. And that there's a similar kind of elation that you get out of studying this detail and having your mind exposed to saying, aha, I never thought about it that way, but that's really interesting. So you either develop that, right? The more you do it, obviously, the better you get at it, and the more you start to feel a pleasure of it, right? But also, who are we? And again, my summary of religion and what it's trying to accomplish is, what is my relationship to the world? What is my relationship? Here I am, so insignificant in a vast, infinite universe. And what is the purpose of my existence? And it gets into that kind of very deep stuff, which I
yeah,
think can be a source of joy and strength and health and all kinds of things, which if you just kind of, no big deal, or everybody does it, or those kinds of arguments, um, actually leave
yeah.
you very exposed to pretty dangerous stuff.
Okay, all right. It's the hour is moving
Yes, it
along
is. We
here.
definitely have to stop. I know.
Okay,
Take care and thank
you've
you,
got
though.
3 more hours a day than I have. Okay.
Take care, everyone. Stay well. God willing, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Yes,
Okay.
Shabbat shalom.